print, email, Facebook, Twitter. More bush cancer patients travel hundreds of kilometers for life-saving treatment. Media player, space to play, M to mute, left and right to seek, 00:3800:0015:38 each year. More than 130,000 Australians are diagnosed with cancer, and while more people are surviving cancer than ever before, there is a disparity in survival rates for patients in regional and metropolitan Australia. The 2017 Australian Cancer Council report states that cancer patients in the bush are more likely to die than those living in the city. The main factors associated with this disparity are distance to treatment services, later tumour stage at diagnosis, due to reduced access to a GP, limited access to treatment facilities, and socio-economic disadvantage. Director of Oncology at the Albury-Wodonga Cancer Centre in southern New South Wales, Dr. Craig Underhill, said at least 1,000 more people were dying in regional Australia from cancer than in the cities each year. Dr. Underhill is concerned that many patients find it too difficult to access treatment. They decide not to access care at all, he said. Instead of having palliative chemotherapy, they decide not to have any treatment, so of course that has a detrimental effect on outcomes. Cancer Australia Chief Executive Sanchia Randa said patients with colorectal cancer who live 500 kilometres further away from treatment had a 40% higher risk of dying. For every 100 kilometres that you live from a radiotherapy treatment centre, your risk of death from colorectal cancer goes up by 8%, she said. Travelling 14 hours for life-saving treatment. Helen Wilson, a nurse from Mildura in regional Victoria, required a left mastectomy after she was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2016. She needed to do the 14-hour round trip to Melbourne for the surgery, and then every 3 weeks, for life-saving treatment. The treatment incapacitated her, but Ms. Wilson said it was the excessive travel that was the hardest to cope with. On top of that fact that I was fighting for my life, the cost of travel and accommodation caused undue financial stress, as I needed to cover these costs up front, she said. If I could have had my radiotherapy once a week in Mildura, it would have made the whole experience so much easier to cope with. A 900 kilometers trip there and back. Diane Stewart's battle with cancer began just before Christmas 2015, when she was diagnosed with follicular non-hodgkins lymphoma. The initial shock of the diagnosis was compounded by the need to drive the 900 kilometers round trip to Adelaide from her home in Wentworth, New South Wales, for regular treatment. For the then 70-year-old, the travel was daunting. My travel costs were reimbursed, but finding the funds to cover the fuel and accommodation up front did contribute a fair bit of stress, Mrs. Stewart said. Some days I was too sick to travel, which added additional accommodation costs to my treatment. After having chemotherapy for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in 2015, Mrs. Stewart was again diagnosed with cancer in June 2017, this time involving her colon. Fortunately, I was able to have surgery and chemotherapy treatment in Mildura, Victoria, only 35 minutes across the border from my hometown of Wentworth, she said. Being able to receive treatment nearby and be close to my family and support network has made my recovery so much better, Mrs. Stewart said. The local hospital staff are very supportive and have made my chemo and all the challenges that go with it just that little bit easier. Mrs. Stewart's lymphoma has returned and she is again facing extensive travel to Adelaide for treatment. Addressing the disparity between the city and the bush, cancer specialists have been lobbying governments for more than a decade to help address the disparity in cancer outcomes in regional and metropolitan Australia. In North Queensland, telehealth chemotherapy is reducing the need for patients to travel hundreds of kilometres for treatment. Patients can instead receive chemotherapy at their local hospital. Locally trained nursing staff deliver the treatment with support from a clinical specialist via telehealth. 10 government-funded regional cancer treatment centres have been established across Australia. Albury-Wodonga did not receive one of the centres, but has established its own, through a public-private partnership. The centre's Director of Oncology, Dr. Underhill, said regional cancer services had come a long way in improving outcomes for patients in the bush, but more needed to be done. He said due to the success of the new centres, patient numbers had exceeded expectations and staff were working beyond sustainable limits. Federal Health Minister Greg Hunt said his priority was a new rural health workforce package. That's something that I'm very hopeful we can deliver, Mr. Hunt said. that won't just help within the cancer and oncology space, but it's about assisting with the rural health workforce right across the board, Mr. Hunt